Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're going to discuss Chapter 4 of our textbook. This is Criminal Law, CRJS 312, 312. And I'm going to be lecturing today from an older version of our textbook, Contemporary Criminal Law. We're going to be talking from the second edition. I'm going to be lecturing from the second edition, but of course, the chapters go along with they actually go along with the chapters in the newest edition. I think the only time the chapters change is they change order with 10 and 11 in the newest edition switching places. But we'll get to that when we get to those lectures. Let's talk. Chapter 4 is about actus reus. Now we're kind of chapter 3 we had talked about punishment, which just how punishment structures go, which really wasn't substantive. We didn't learn a lot of law. We talked about the Eighth Amendment, right? But we didn't learn a lot of substantive criminal law in chapter 3 because we were just talking about punishment. Chapter 2, we hit on a little bit of substantive law because we talked about constitutional limitations. So we talked about what laws can and can't do. And in chapter 3, we talked about what punishment can and can't do. Now we're finally moving from the do's and don'ts of law, and we're starting to move into what crimes are. So when I say substantive, that is the substance of criminal law. In other words, what is the definition of laws? What makes up a law? So now we're going to get into the first. This chapter, chapter 4, is about the actus reus, or criminal act. So we're going to get into the elements of the general elements of crimes themselves. Every crime has an actus reus. Now we're going to get to a future chapter where we talk about the mens rea, or the mental state. Every crime does not have to have a mens rea, but every crime has to have has an actus reus in its definition. That means every crime requires a criminal act or culpable omission, and we'll talk about what that means in a second. So, as an introduction, a crime requires proof beyond reasonable doubt of an actus reus, a criminal act, as well as criminal intent or mens rea. So, in some situations, a mens rea may not be a part of the definition of certain crimes, but every crime has an actus reus. That means you can't be guilty if you don't take an act or what we call a culpable or guilty omission from acting. Omission means you didn't do something. You failed to do something you were supposed to do. So let's talk about it. Criminal acts. The criminal law punishes acts, not thoughts. A criminal intent without an act is not punishable. So what that means is you may say, I really want to kill that person. It's a bad thought, right? Depending on your religion, your God may not like it. But in criminal law, the law of the land, you're not going to be punished for that impure thought. Now, what you are going to be punished for is your actions. Your actions or your culpable omissions. So what does culpable omission mean? That means you failed to act where you had a duty to act. In other words, that means based upon your relationship with a victim or someone you were supposed to act on behalf of, whether it be parental, whether it be, contractual, whether it be based upon an employer, or, your job and what you're supposed to do. Sometimes your failure to act, meaning you didn't do anything at all, but you purposely didn't do anything at all, and your inaction caused a harm, and you were supposed to act. Now that normally doesn't apply to regular people. So a regular person, it doesn't walk around. A regular person without a duty, and duty means that means you're in a place where you're supposed to do something, either by your relationship with the person, or by the job you have, or by contract. So if you're not in any one of those relationships, you don't have to walk around trying to save people. That's what culpable omission means. It means, so what the actus reus punishes is it doesn't just punish acts, you doing something. It also punishes you not taking action in a situation where you're required based upon a duty to take an action. So let's talk about that. What's that mean? That means that if I, as a parent, put my child in a situation where they're in peril, and I fail to act in trying to save them. And I see them and I know they're in peril, but I sit there and let it happen. I don't tell any authorities. I just let it happen. I let them drown. I let them get hurt, and I watch it. That could be what we call a culpable. Culpable means guilty. Anytime we talk about culpability, it means guiltiness or blameworthiness. So that means that's what we call a guilty omission. Omission, omission, omission. Omission is or to omit, which is the verb. That omission is the noun form of it, and omit is the action or the verb. To omit is to, and that's omit, is to not do something. Is to fail to do something. I omitted. That means I didn't take action. So it's called a culpable omission, a guilty failure to act. So another situation, let's say based upon my job or contract, if I'm a lifeguard at a swimming pool, and let me get a name. Let me think of a famous person's name. Dave Chappelle, my favorite comedian. Let's say I'm a lifeguard. I'm on duty. This is my job. I'm based upon contract, and by job, my duty is to save people that I know that if I see a person in peril, I'm supposed to try to save them. Now, I'm not held responsible if I'm turning around talking or looking at somebody else doing something or stopping someone else or doing something in the pool that's dangerous, and meanwhile, Dave Chappelle's over here drowning and I never see it. But if it's a situation where I see Dave Chappelle over there drowning and I say, I don't like Dave Chappelle, I'm not going to jump in and save him. I'm going to let him die. That is a culpable, what we call a culpable omission. And that's treated the same way as an act. So there was a duty to act, and I omitted from doing so. There's an omission to act where I had a duty to do so. That is that is classified as an act when it comes to actus reus. Now, that's criminal acts. Now we're going to talk about voluntary acts. These acts must be voluntary. And I just gave you an example of a situation where it may not be voluntary. I may fail to do something I'm supposed to do, but if I don't do it voluntarily, then it's not an actus reus. It can't be considered for trying to build the elements of a crime. So if my attention is elsewhere, and I'm like, hey, stop horsing around in the pool, or stop, don't make me get down from here. You guys stop. Meanwhile, Dave Chappelle's over there and he's drowning, ask for help or whatever, or he can't ask for help because he's drowning. I don't see it. And by the time I turn around, now he's dead. And I'm like, oh, Dave, and now he's dead. That was not what we call a voluntary failure to act. So it must be voluntary. Then voluntary means done at one's own volition or done on purpose. In other words, now let's talk about voluntary when it comes to actions. So, if I shoot someone, voluntariness doesn't have anything to do with your intent. It just means to do with whether or not your body committed the act and it did so knowing it was doing it. So if I go out here and I fire a weapon, and now I can have a different intent. There's several different intents I can have. Intents, not tense like over your head. Intents. There are several intents I can have while firing a weapon. I can fire a weapon with an intent to shoot a target. I can knowingly fire a weapon. And I can have an intent to kill someone. But the thing is, no matter what the intent is, the question of voluntariness is, did I do it myself? And that's what voluntary means. It means an act that you've taken yourself, and it's nothing you've done. You've done it, and you have knowledge of you doing it. So let's say, what's the question? If I'm sleepwalking, now this is hypothetical. If I do something unknowingly and it's not, and I'm sleepwalking, I think I'm at war, and I pull the trigger and I end up picking up a gun and shooting and killing somebody. I'm like, oh, I was sleepwalking, or I was under hypnosis. Now, those are hypothetical situations, but technically, I didn't take that. I didn't voluntarily commit that act. So it must be something I do at my own volition, pulling the trigger. And it's also something I failed to do at my own volition. I meant to not do it. Now, well, yeah, meant goes into mens rea. But in other words, my body knew that I wasn't doing it, and I was actively not doing what I was supposed to do. So that's what we talk about. We talk about voluntary. It's something you are doing, not something that someone else is doing. Not something that I'm trying to think of the word, that you're not doing at your own volition, but something that you know you're taking the action. So if you're sleepwalking, you don't know it. You're not conscious. In other words, it's something you're conscious of and your body's actively doing. That's what voluntary act means. So when we say voluntary, that doesn't necessarily mean the mens rea or intent. It just means that your action themselves, the actions you take are taken voluntarily, meaning you're doing them. So that's what that means. Now we're going to talk about status offenses. A status such as homeless person may not constitute a crime. Due process requires proof of a criminal act. And I think I did talk about this in our chapter 3 discussion. We talked about, drug addicts or crackheads. Those people, and even being a drug dealer, that is a status. That's my, if I say I'm a drug dealer, I deal drugs, that's my job. You're not arrested for who you are. You're arrested for what you do. So when you're charged with the crime, it's never about who you are. It's about what you do. And we'll talk about when it is about who you are. And who you are is based upon prior convictions. But it's about what you do. So if I deal drugs and I'm arrested for an act. So I'm arrested for either possessing drugs, because I get caught, I got drugs, and I might have enough drugs, and the amount of the drugs might be enough where they say, hey, based upon this amount, there is an intent to sell and distribute this drug. This is not a personal use amount. It's 8 pounds of weed or something like that, or depending on how it's packaged, it's bagged a certain way, and it's bagged to distribute. So that is an act. So same thing with being a drug addict. A drug addict is not arrested because they're addicted to drugs. They're arrested because they had drugs. They just happen to be a person that's addicted to drugs, but they were caught with drugs on them. So that is possession. That's possession. So you're only sentenced for your actions. Charged and punished for actions, not for statuses. So they can't just say he's a homeless guy, we're going to arrest him. He has to be, he may be homeless, but he has to be committing an act that is illegal, like vagrancy, or trespass. So a lot of homeless folks get arrested for that, or public intoxication, or disruptive conduct, stuff like that. Those are acts they have to take to be in violation of the law. They're not arrested just because they're homeless and we don't like the way they look or smell. Now, does that play into law enforcement's targeting of these people? Yes, it does. So it looks like, they're arresting that person because he's homeless. They're not arresting them because they're homeless. They're targeting them because they're homeless. Because who's more likely to be a vagrant outside with nowhere to go and nothing to do than a homeless person. So it ends up being a biased situation where now there are people who aren't really up to anything, but they're being targeted. And the one thing that happens with law enforcement, if they target you and they want you to go to jail for something, they're going to create the reason. He talked too loud. That's disruptive conduct. Or he smells of liquor, so he's acting crazy. So that's intoxicating and disruptive conduct. So it ends up, as we talked about in other chapters about law enforcement having unfettered discretion. It ends up being a situation where when they target people like that, they can almost pin any type of charge on them. But from a technical standpoint, what they're accused of, not necessarily what they did, because they may not even be convicted of it, right? But what they're accused of has to be based on an allegation that alleges that they committed an act or an omission. So that the only status offenses are when you have been convicted of a certain amount of crimes. Let's say you might be a habitual felon. That is a status that you can be punished for. So if you have a laundry list of felonies, you have 4 or 5 felonies, convictions over your record over a period of time, and now you're in here for felony number 9. Um, uh, what that means under status offenses, under habitual status offenses, you can now, if you're convicted of that felony, that is now and you're indicted or charged with habitual felon, that means you're now habitual felon status. That means if you're convicted of this new felony, you're going to be punished harsher as a habitual felon. So habitual felon itself is a crime of status. In other words, is what you qualify for based upon your record. But it's actually the punishment of the crime you committed. So it's not so all habitual felon status does is it graduates and it changes the classification of the crime. So this may just be a class I felony at the low in North Carolina, the lowest level on the lowest felony classification on the totem pole. But because you have all these other felony convictions before and you've been charged with habitual felon along with this felony, what that means is if you get convicted, plead guilty, or found guilty without them dismissing the habitual felon, let's say you're convicted and then they also charge you with habitual felon. Now they also have to prove that you're guilty of being a habitual felon, but that's easy to do. You got this felony and you got these other ones that are already on your record. So the jury just saw you get convicted of this one, so it's easy. But you're not punished for what's happening is the felony that you just got sentenced, that you just got convicted of. That all it does is it graduates that felony. It says this felony is now no longer a class H. We're going to bump it up to a class G or something like that. It just means you're going to be sentenced harsher for this felony. That's what it means. But those are the only status offenses that you can get, and that's habitual offenses. I think some states call them like 3 strikes or stuff like that. So essentially that third serious felony is now going to be graduated to something else. It's going to be sentenced harsher. So that's the only, when we talk about status offenses, those are the only status offenses that are essentially constitutional. Anything else, you can't convict me for being black. You can't convict me for being homeless. I have to have committed an act or failed to act when I had a duty to act. That's all the actus reus is. You acted or you didn't act when you were supposed to. Like I said, omissions, as I said before. Omissions, a failure to fulfill a duty to act may qualify as an actus reus. And I've already given you an example. Possession. The possession of a dangerous item or prohibited item such as drugs or explosives may constitute a crime. Also, possession with a status. So let's say if a person is convicted of a felony, once they're convicted of a felony, that puts them in the status of being legally they're a felon. There's certain rights they lose, like the right to bear arms in most jurisdictions, especially in North Carolina. If a person has a felony conviction that has not been expunged or something like that and is still on their record, like they are a felon, technically in the status of a felon, and they possess a handgun or they possess any firearm at all, they can be charged with the crime of possession of a firearm by a felon. And the act there is the possession. So possession is an act. Now, to prove possession, they have to prove that you knew that you had it. Now it's hard to prove what they knew, what you know, but sometimes what you know or didn't know is proven through circumstances, like where it was located and stuff like that. You have different types of possession. You have regular possession when you have it, it's in your pocket. I know I got my keys in my pocket. But and then there's constructive possession when something is not necessarily let's say something is located in a central area and there's multiple people in the room and have control of it or can get to it or can touch it and they know it's there. That constructive possession now says that all 4 of us are simultaneously in possession of it because it's in the room. We know it's there. We know what it is, and we are remaining around it. That puts us in constructive possession. That's why when people get pulled over in a car, and let's say no one fesses up to the weed that's obviously in the car, and no one wants to fess up and say, "Oh, I'll take responsibility for it." They end up charging everyone in the car. Well, you all knew it was here, and you're all in the car. Now it's everybody's weed, and that is the doctrine of constructive possession. There are also other types of possession. What's the other one where you let me see here. Let me look up possession in this book here. It's the last part. Okay, yeah. Actual possession is when you physically have something. Constructive possession is when, and joint possession is when multiple people have it. So constructive possession refers to contraband that is outside of an individual's physical control, but over which he or she exercises control through access to the location where the contraband is stored. So they call constructive. So we call it construct. That's in North Carolina. We define that. We define multiple people having control of something. It may not be in one person's pocket, but if it's not in one person's pocket, it's somewhere centrally located, and everybody in the same room or vicinity or car knows it's there. They all possess it. In the book, they call that joint possession. But in North Carolina, we call that constructive possession. But the book's definition of constructive possession, it refers to, so let's talk about all the possessions. Actual possession refers to drugs and other contraband within an individual's physical possession or immediate reach. And of course, they have to know it's there and know what it is. So it's not just it's there, but you know it's there and you know the nature of what it is. Constructive possession refers to contraband that is outside of an individual's actual physical control, but over which he or she exercises control through access to the location where the contraband is stored, or through ability to control an individual who has physical control over the contraband. A lot of times that's why drug dealers and kingpins, like there's a stash house, and you may not never see the kingpin at the stash house, but the kingpin knows where the stash house is, and he makes the guy who runs the stash house make the moves. So in other words, that's kind of how that conspiracy thing works, because now I can make other people, I have constructive possession because I'm not physically there, but I know it's there, it's under my control, and I can make other people go get it and do stuff. So it's almost like I can use a remote control to access it, and even though it's not technically a remote control, but I can make other people access something that's technically mine. A drug dealer has constructive possession over narcotics stored in his or her home or under the physical control of a member of his or her gang. Then you have joint possession. And it's not joint possession. I mean, joint is in multiple people. It refers to a situation in which a number of individuals exercise control over contraband. Several members of a gang may all live in the home where drugs are stored. There must be specific proof connecting each individual to the drugs. The fact that a gang member lives in the house is not sufficient. So normally when we see joint, what they call in the book, they call it joint possession. But in North Carolina, we always call it constructive possession. It's in a car. So they get pulled over, there's weed somewhere, weed in the floorboard, weed sitting on the floorboard, the cop pulls it up, and he's like, "Whose is this?" And everybody's like, "That ain't mine." And all four of them say it ain't theirs, and no one wants to take responsibility. So the cop says, "You know what? It's all of y'all's then." In a certain situation, it's kind of messed up because they do have to prove that it's in a place where everyone would have had access to it and not just have knowledge of it and access to it. If something's in the front floorboard, the person in the back seat doesn't have immediate reach and control over it. They're literally going to climb over somebody, and the person is in a place where the person in the back seat can't see it and may not know it's theirs. There's more likely than not that person in the back seat doesn't even know that it's there. So why charge everybody in the car with it? Now, if you get pulled over and there's a blunt being passed in the car, that's definitely joint possession, because all of you are in a position where you know it's there. It's not wrapped up in a bag in the floor. It's a clam bake going on in the car, and the blunt's going around the car. Everybody's smoking it, or even if you're not smoking it, you may say, "No, I don't smoke." It may be getting passed to everybody else but you, but you're in the car and you know it's there. You even though you haven't taken control over it or physically had it, you're in a position where you can, and you know what it is. So that also makes you a joint possessor. Then we have knowing possession. It refers to an individual's awareness that he or she is in possession of contraband. A drug dealer, for instance, is aware that marijuana is in his or her pocket. Mere possession refers to physical control without awareness of contraband. An individual may be paid by a drug dealer to carry a suitcase across international borders and lack awareness that the luggage contains drugs. So it's not just knowing; it's knowing and having reason to know. In certain situations, like you can possess stolen property, right? If someone comes to me with a whole bunch of gold or some diamonds, some very valuable stuff, and they sell it to me. They say, you know what? I got this 80-inch flat screen. I give it to you for $45. It's a great price for 80 degree, 80-inch flat screen. In that situation, anyone is willing to give up something like that for that price. You have to ask them, is it yours? So sometimes it's a situation where you may not necessarily know how that the product was stolen, but you may have reason to know. That's why you have to ask some questions. So sometimes it's not just about knowing; it's knowing, especially when it comes to possession of stolen property. It's not so either you know it's stolen or you have reason to know. In other words, a reasonable person would say, "Okay, how'd you get this?" Of course, that can be refuted and defended if you ask the person how they got it, and they say, "Oh, it's mine." The only reason I bought it from him is I asked him. I said, "Did you steal this?" And he said, "No, it's mine. I'm just trying to liquidate assets, and I need some cash." So if you say that, and it's proven that that person said that, why should you not believe them? You ask the question. So that would be my argument. So in some of these situations, these cases, and the stuff we're talking about, you're going to be thinking, and I want you to get to the point where you're thinking about possible legal arguments and how you could defend something like that. So, but mere possession by itself is normally not enough. We have to prove that a person knew or had a reason to know what the substance was, what the contraband was. So that's possession. Let me go back and make sure I finished everything. I think possession was the last thing we were talking about. Yes. So that's chapter 4. So what I want you guys to get from chapter 4 is I want you to know that we're talking about actus reus. We're talking about actions and culpable. Voluntary acts and culpable omissions. So culpable meaning that it's a guilty failure to act. In other words, it's a guilty failure to act or a failure to act where there's a duty. So those are the two. Those are the two things that can be considered actus reus, and possession itself is an action. So the types of actions you got the physical voluntary acts, right? So you hit somebody, you punch them in the face. That's an act. That's a voluntary act. Or you can fail to act where you had a duty to act. You're a lifeguard. You knew someone was drowning, but you didn't like him very much, so you let him go. That's an omission, a culpable omission. And then you have possession, which is also considered an action. So study the chapter, read up on it. Like I said, I'm just giving lectures and talking about the stuff. You still got to read and study on your own to prepare, and that's why we'll also meet at some point in time, or maybe even have we're going to have Zooms for this class. Now I'm going to use this video again, so this video is ever used again. Every class doesn't necessarily require synchronous meetings, but definitely read the book. That's the one thing you can control, whether we meet or not. Reading the book and listening to this lecture, or those are things that you can control. To make sure you got the information. So, without further ado, that is chapter 4, actus reus. Be good.